Hi, this is Liqian Ren, Director of Modern Alpha Wisdom Tree ETFs. Welcome to China of Tomorrow podcast series, where we navigate China, India, Japan, and the broader emerging markets with members of Wisdom Tree and other industry leaders. We have Professor Thomas Mullaney in history from Stanford University joining us. Professor Mullaney specializes in East Asia language and cultures, is the author of a very exciting upcoming book, Chinese Computers, from MIT Press. Before we go into detailed discussion of this very timely and interesting topic, which will help us understand the next decade, probably a theme of US-China tech competition, I'll quickly comment on general landscape of China's economy, because January, February data in China are inherently very hard to adjust due to Chinese New Year. It is very much more prudent to wait for March data. I think the hardest thing to predict this year or forecast this year will be China's inflation, because China's GDP, if the government sets a goal as 5%, usually it will be close to 5. So I think being able to predict the GDP well is not really the top skill right now, if one can have a good read on China's inflation, which is also harder to manipulate. I think we've been seeing this, and at least I've been seeing this for more than a year, is that I think the housing bubble burst is still impacting negatively on investment and consumption. There are some talk about housing finally bottoming. I don't think that's the situation yet. Government is trying to do some things, such as helping one top real estate developer, Vanke, which is based in Shenzhen, and also partly owned by the local Shenzhen government, to meet near-term debt obligations. But given the new government's focus is to develop technology to counter U.S. sanctions or U.S. restrictions, the government is, I think, unlikely to do significantly extra in terms of stimulus. Professor Mullaney is also the author of many other interesting books, including The Chinese Typewriter, which won the Fairbank Prize, Your Computer is on Fire, and Coming to Terms with the Nation, Ethnic Classification in Modern China, all very interesting, aside from the current book, upcoming Chinese Computers. As US and China engage in tech competition and AI seemed unstoppable, at least as a thing right now, it is interesting to look back on the history of Chinese computers, as many may not realize that Chinese language is not phonetic, so it has no alphabet as we, English speakers think about. So computers, as originally developed using the English alphabet in the US, cannot be easily used in Chinese language or in many other similar languages. So let's go straight to questions for Professor Mullaney. Naturally, it's always fascinating for outsiders to wonder, how do you develop interest in East Asia and China and becoming an expert and writing so many wonderful books? When I was born and grew up in China, US seems so far away. And I, assume for a typical American, probably also feel China or East Asia is so far away. Like, what got you to be interested in this area?
Well, I want to begin by thanking you for inviting me to have this conversation, and thank you for your interest in my work. The answer is very simple. It's Li Laoshi. It's the first Chinese language instructor I had at Johns Hopkins University, who, as a, 17-year-old without any clear path, a lot of passions, but no clear path, really accidentally wandered into her class because my first goal of Arabic was not open. I couldn't fit Arabic, Introduction to Arabic, in my schedule that year, I remember. And so I decided to do a different language first, and then I would eventually pick up Arabic in second year. I stumbled into Li Laoshi's class, and she was simultaneously one of the best teachers, just pedagogue that I've ever to this day met. Joyous, funny, brilliant. And I sort of woke up one day studying abroad in Beijing and learning the language. And that chance encounter sent me down the path. So many people might assume that one studies as a person not of Chinese descent from the United States, studying China as a country out in the world, a civilization, a culture, that it was a long-standing thing that if you had met me as a 5-year-old, you'd be like, that kid is really into China. It would be just the opposite, that there was nothing to indicate that this would turn out
It's
to be
so
how I have spent my life.
It's fascinating because just from the few words that you pronounced, I can see your Chinese is very good. Considering you didn't, really grow up, and I think also me personally as well. A few people in my life just random and happens, almost feels like power out of your word and change the life path of my,
Absolutely.
and particularly with US-China relationship. There are many people who have this. So this is really a wonderful book. Actually, I did read your previous book, Chinese Typewriters. So I think, so really look forward to this book. On this specific book, you mentioned that it is really fascinating people. It's really the people who made the book wonderful, to the people who developed electronic Chinese input methods. So software programs that enable the Chinese characters to be produced using English keyboard. That's my understanding. It was really an interesting efforts from US, China, from military, academic, and businesses. So help tell a few stories. For example, you mentioned that CIA is also, had a contribution. So tell us, let's start with, then, why is CIA involved?
Well, I think you have to extrapolate out to military and intelligence circles more broadly. This was, pragmatically speaking, the idea was that whoever was the first to develop a system capable of producing Chinese language text on an industrial scale would stand to flood the world with propaganda of a particular political valence. So the U.S. military, Taiwanese military, Soviet military, PRC military it's through the largely the 50s, 60s, 70s, really concerned in many ways of being the one who is capable of generating text within the Chinese language, in the same way that by this point in the story, the electro-automatic production of English was already cracked. That puzzle had already been cracked. We could produce untold quantities of English language or French language, Italian language, German language material. But now we're in this context, in this day and age, in the Cold War context. Of course, prior to the Sino-Soviet split of 1960, you have the Sino-Soviet bloc, and so it fits into the Cold War context. And this notion is that, well, there is not yet a way to electro-automatically produce Chinese text, and if the U.S. intelligence force or military is the first to be able to get to that finish line, that there are political benefits to that. But there were alongside military, academics, businesses, individual entrepreneurs, hobbyists, amateurs, and from the world over, from all around the world. And effectively, I think nowadays engineers would call it a wicked hard problem. And there's something about wicked hard problems that really attract engineering mindsets. And so the question of how to computerize Chinese becomes one of those problems. I mean, I have records of engineering classes at Stanford University in the mid 20th century where that is actually the assignment that students were asked to reflect upon, because it's a wicked hard problem. How do you fit a writing system with 100,000 characters, let's just say for a round number, with no alphabet? How do you fit that onto a tabletop device? It makes design thinking look like child's play by comparison if you could crack this, if you could crack this code, solve this puzzle.
And it's amazing that now it seems so simple. All you need is a
Yep.
little add-on. You can produce,
They did it.
you know,
Yeah,
uh,
it worked. It worked, and and now it's taken for granted. You're right.
Um, help us understand some stories on how Chinese side. I mean, I think for people who really do not understand China, China in 1949 really has no industrial base. I think this also translates into political power for the party, because even though there are so many, horror stories, the fact is, China has improved tremendously industrial production wise, and many local people do give some of these credits to the party. So, tell us how Chinese side is effort, because considering how they were not that, they were really low tech if you think about it compared to the U.S.
Oh, sure. I mean, um, coming out of the Second World War, the sort of main financial industrial bases, at least of the mainland, uh, were devastated. Of course, the main industrial base at the end of the war is Japanese-controlled Manchuria, of the puppet state of Manchukuo, where Japan had invested a great deal of infrastructure. Similar story on the Korean Peninsula, that now we think of South Korea as the industrial sort of juggernaut of the peninsula, but at this day and age, North Korea, the northern part of the peninsula, was actually where Japanese colonial forces had industrialized, and the South was sort of the breadbasket. And it was the Korean War that basically inverted that, because the North was just carpet bombed into oblivion over the latter stages of that conflict, and that ends up destroying effectively the infrastructure that Japan had built in that part of the peninsula. So you're right that uh, it is not, and really China's only one friend in the world with industrial power at this point is the Soviet Union. The big, our revolutionary elder brothers, as they were referred to in 1949, all the way up to the great rift between these two powers in the 60s. But they had to do a lot with very little. They had to do a lot with very little. And one fascinating story that I talk about in the book is a delegation of American computer scientists who traveled to the PRC very shortly after the Nixon visit, the very famous visit, the high-level delegation between U.S. President and Chairman Mao, but mainly Zhou Enlai, because Mao was already in very ill health at that point. But shortly thereafter, a delegation of basically it's like the all-star team of American computer scientists visit the PRC, and they write reports back about being blown away about how much further China was in computing than they had ever dreamed. They were definitely far behind the United States. They were the Soviet Union, but I think that this delegation really expected it to be effectively a condition of at zero. And it turns out that mainland China had been investing first with Soviet help, but then after the split with the Soviet Union in 1960 on its own, and had by the time of their visit a pretty robust set of centers mainly in Shanghai and Beijing, that were trying to advance specifically mathematical computing. They really were worried at that point about computational models and simulations of economic systems, simulations of weaponry and so forth. And it really surprised this delegation of CS. They wrote reports about it on their return, saying we had no idea how far China had made, first with Soviet help, but then largely on its own.
So I was a computer science student in 1993 at Peking University. I remember so clearly that at that time, this the issue you mentioned has generally been solved. At that time, my classmates and I I was not a very good student, but I know my classmates were really, some of them were really good students, and they were in the, the Olympiad teams, and they still really who's who in current China's computer software, and we were in software. And I remember distinctly our obligation or job was to develop an operating system for China. And actually, that's a different story. Probably one day we'll write somebody who's going to write a book on it. I can share that at that time, one of our homework was to study the OS2 system by IBM, which didn't take it off because at that time there was some talks that IBM could, be a serious competitor to the Windows system. But again, I think how important, how does the businesses like IBM is involved in this effort?
Hmm. And just as a side note, I have a whole section of a chapter about the development of Chinese operating systems, CC DOS. It's an absolutely fascinating story of simulation and retrofitting and fangzhou and all of this stuff. But I mean, corporations have been part of this story since since the 19th century, because as with the allure of other industries trying to break into the China market, this place of however many millions of consumers, it was the same story, the same kind of appeal for the likes of the Remington Corporation in the era of typewriters, Olivetti for typewriters, IBM, both for, at the outset, typewriters, but then eventually computers later in the story. And so another one of the most important companies that people don't think about anymore, the Mergenthaler Linotype Company, which is an incredibly important company in the history of print technology. All of them, all of them desperately wanted to break into the China market, and all of them failed for the greater part of this history because of the writing system. They the model that they had adopted for the greater part of the 20th century was a model of, I mean, nowadays we would call it localization. The idea that you start with something, you have a starting technology, an app that, I don't know, is a taco delivery app that is on the market, and now you want to internationalize and localize. And so what you do is you take the buttons and you translate the buttons and you translate the menus, and you maybe the color scheme, if it's not brand ID, you adjust it or whatever. But the starting point, the architecture of the starting point should ideally stay consistent, 90+% the same architecture. They did that same thing, but with typewriters. And it worked for most of the world. It worked. So they started out with their manufacturing plants, and they said, okay, this manufacturing plant produces English language typewriters that behave in a very specific way. So how do we retrofit as little as possible to make French and Italian and Russian and Hebrew and Arabic and Korean and so forth? And for the better part of these languages and writing systems, they were able to pull off this internationalization, localization kind of feat or trick. But then came the model of internationalization, the model of localization rammed headlong into the Chinese writing system that effectively they would have had to go back to first principles. They would have had to rethink what a typewriter even is, what a computer even is, and they were unwilling, understandably, to do that. They're like, well, we can't blow it all up and start over. And so consistently, all of these different companies with these different technologies came to the water's edge of Chinese writing and failed, and then sort of abandoned the market temporarily, but always with hopes of coming back. And so these companies like IBM were, in their own way, always on the lookout for inventors and engineers around the world, maybe in the Chinese-speaking world, but maybe outside it, who perhaps had solved these wicked problems. And engineers all around the world, inventors all around the world. I have correspondents. They would write letters to Watson Jr. They would write letters to all of these companies saying, "Hi, I'm so and so in this city, and I think I have cracked the code of Chinese for this." And what's amazing is that in these offices, like you literally have correspondence of high executives at IBM passing these letters back and forth, being like, is this person nuts? Is this one of these crazy letters we get from, from someone out there in the world, or is this a genius?
Yeah,
Is
so
this a genius or or an insane person
there's a
telling
Chinese
us that they've
word
cracked the
called
code?
people science, right? 民科.
Yeah, is this and so who is this? And some of these individuals, I mean, they were of great, they had real bona fides. They were coming from engineering programs. Some of these individuals managed to secure partnerships, in some sense contracts, with the likes of IBM. And one such partnership led to the prototype of the first ever electro-automatic Chinese machine in history. This was the IBM electric Chinese typewriter. That's what I talk about in chapter 1. But the whole time, the whole partnership, Watson Jr., all of these high ups at both IBM and Mergenthaler Linotype, they're never quite sure as to whether or not this idea has legs, or if they've become enamored of a madman.
So who and which team really kind of cracked the code? Is it through the businesses or
It was ultimately I mean, I think you'd have to call it a kind of military industrial academic complex. I mean, it was, so the first ever Chinese computer, known as the Sinotype, also known as the ideographic encoder, was technically developed by a nonprofit organization called the Graphic Arts Research Foundation, spearheaded by a professor of electrical engineering at MIT who spoke not a word of Chinese, but collaborated with scholars of the Chinese language and often of Chinese descent at Columbia and Harvard, with funding from the military, the US military, and then eventually in concert with, in later iterations of this machine, in concert with Shanghai-based engineers. And so that's the thing about the book. It's called The Chinese Computer, but the Chinese of this is not so straightforward. It's not computers invented by people who are nationally or ethnically Chinese. It is not computers developed by a nation state, that is China. It is this global transnational puzzle that lots of people from many walks of life were drawn to, and that ultimately was, the puzzle was solved through this distributed process, most of which was defined by failure. Most of the story that I talk about, it's a weird narrative. I mean, my book is weird. It is failure, 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 IT juggernaut. I mean, it really, like, it is not, it's not it's not like watching a military campaign of the steady conquest and acquisition of territory until finally you have the Roman Empire. It is prototype failed, diminished into obscurity, prototype, obscurity. But out of all of these failures, different elements of the answer were hit upon, and then will become a permanent part of everything that follows, even though they themselves were a failure in the story, so to speak. They failed to achieve commercial success, commercial manufacturing, whatever it is. But they had solved some piece of the puzzle, and those legacies are still with us today.
That's really interesting because I think recently many people will ask, in terms of US-China competition in technology, and US inherently has advantage for really two reasons. I don't know whether you can help also illustrate a little bit more. I think first is US really has a very well established you can say industrial, academic, business cooperation in a good way or bad way. But the US does have this system where money can be spent on things which is considered, years ago, a completely impossible to solve question. And then try it, and got it, fail, and then try again. So I feel like US is inherently, that's probably one of the bigger reasons US is at the innovation edge, because it can try it in so many different ways, and And China probably a little bit lacking in these, because I think what China is good at is, um, if something already kind of somewhat invented, but to make it industrialized or make it a larger scale, but it's not very good in getting to the getting to the first success. I don't know whether this is true, but some of the at least the discussion is this, and I wonder, what by writing this book, like what kind of things you have learned, how the different ways of innovate in US and China.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think that, um, and I do think I've heard that argument, and I do understand the argument. I think that it empirically does make sense. I think we also have to remember that even within any given national context outside of China, be it the United States, be it the UK, be it Germany, that be it Japan, that second element of taking something that exists and turning it into something that is systematized, routinized, industrialized, scalable, is often at the heart of so much. Like, why, I forget, I'm trying to remember the former Stanford president who's, I'm blanking right now, but effectively, which is more important, the development of the microprocessor or the development of the ability to mass produce these things at a scale of, you know, it 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 is the great question of logistics. We forget that, and literally the etymology of logistics as being the quartering of troops, like lodging of troops during war. And what is the actual moment of success? Is it the landing at Normandy? Is it that moment? That's the moment we show. That's the moment of valor and horror and precision, and this is the moment. But if you were to probably sit down with US war planners and Allied war planners at the time, it's about how many tons of beef and salt and chicken and milk, and where is this going to be distributed? Where is it going to be stored? Where will people? It is quite literally the logistics of everything, where things are won and lost. And so, in this sense, even if it's true, let's hypothetically say that it's true that this argument holds, that China is maybe not the one to come up with the RFID tag, but is the one that figures out how to produce 5 trillion of them so that Target can stick RFID tags on every last thing, and it's, at cost inside its system. Which of these things is more important? And there is that element of it. But I do think what from my book, one thing that I was not on the lookout for, it sort of occurred during the process, which is why I have confidence. Anything that I think is going to happen that happens, I inherently distrust. But when things happen that I really was expecting the opposite, is what you could think of as technological culture. So when I was writing, I've been working on this book for 15 years. ChatGPT was a distant fantasy, but the moment it emerged, I remember sort of watching on TikToks a new video about this thing just got released. You got to take a look at it, and within days, it was everywhere and so forth. And within weeks, I think people are talking about prompts and prompt engineering and what is prompt engineering and et cetera, et cetera. And I sat back in my chair and I said, China has been prompt engineering for 60 years. And what I mean by that is prompting. This is just using this as an example, but one that's on a lot of people's minds right now. What is a prompt? A prompt is, let's just leave it to text, a keyboard. A prompt is a string of letters and numbers and symbols that you feed to a machine. You want a textual output, if we're imagining ChatGPT, and there is a relationship between what you type and what it's supposed to produce. But it's not a simple act of typing a message. You're not saying the cat bit the dog, period. You're giving it a prompt and expecting it to produce something that is different from the thing you actually wrote, because otherwise you just write it yourself, right? And for the Anglophone world, for the Anglophone computing world, this is like, stop the press. What kind of human machine interaction is this? This is this is incredible. What is this? What you type is not what you get, and there's better and worse ways of doing this. And it just hit me, shurufa. Shurufa is prompting. When
Yeah.
every one of the trillion plus sinophone computer users, every last symbol that one enters into a computer is a prompt that triggers a computational process of trying to figure out what it is you want with better refinement, better creativity, better quality. Generative AI is a big leap in that, but it is actually a natural progression from the kind of history we've seen all the way from the 1950s in Chinese IT to now. And so what I'm getting at here is, besides the hardware of all of these questions, NVIDIA and GPUs, et cetera, and who has manufacturing capabilities and income, or import restrictions and so forth, there's this other big part of it which has to do with the general willingness of a group of people, a population, let's say, to generally be more or less willing to try things out. And the simplest way to put this is, I have seen far more 80-year-old men in Shanghai use their phone to buy a newspaper with WeChat or than I have seen 80-year-olds in New York City use their Apple Watch to buy a bagel. Why is it that an 80-year-old in New York City sees buying a bagel with an Apple Watch is ooh, that's far flung. Well, I don't need all of that stuff. I just want my good old ATM card. I want my good old dollar bills. And you see everyday people taking up and trying out these new modes of interaction in the Chinese context. Is that because of Confucianism? No. Is it because of Buddhism? No. Is it because of some sort of essentialism about? No. It's because the argument is that for about 150 years now, there has been a deeply instilled anxiety ever since the 19th century at the technological level that we need to speed up. We need to try things out. We need to be willing to reconsider things, reimagine things, reimagine our language, reimagine the technology per se. And if you do that for 150 years, it creates a different starting point of a willingness of technological uptake, trying things out, and so forth.
Indeed, I think I very much agree. I think that's a point a lot of people don't quite this sentiment of in China, because you can call it 200 years of shame or whichever way, because China was really down in last 200 or 300 years, and it has put this psychic feeling within a typical Chinese that you cannot be left out of the technology innovation. But I think most, I don't know whether it's true or not, but most Chinese will say that China was really didn't join the Industrial Revolution. It was really, if you look at the military equipment in 1840 or early 1900s, when China was invaded by Japan, and didn't really have a very good situation with Britain as well. At that time, if you look at the military equipment of China, is at least like 200 or 150 years behind. If you look at the kinds of guns were used, and it drills this psychic into a typical Chinese that technologically you cannot be left out again. Obviously, this is not necessary. Sometimes it can be overdone, because China is so much more willing to get rid of the old and then try something new. And then end up, some of the older things got destroyed.
Sure.
So tell us really interesting personal stories, like from your book. I think people will really, realize there's really some interesting people in this world who
Oh
made
yeah,
this
no.
happen.
Oh my gosh. I mean, two come to mind. There's the Shanghai engineer I mentioned, Zhi Bingyi. He develops his whole model of Chinese computation while in solitary confinement during the Cultural Revolution. He's seized and imprisoned by Red Guard radicals during the height of Maoism, and he's in solitary confinement with nothing to occupy his mind. He's worried for his life. He's separated from his family, his profession, and all he has is this propaganda poster on the wall saying that if you confess your crimes, we'll treat you leniently. And he begins to sort of mentally disaggregate the characters on this poster and starts to do these sort of mind games. He's trying to keep himself sane. Uh, has no writing utensils at his disposal, no paper, but he does smuggle a pen that he keeps secret from the guards, probably a pen that he used to write self-criticisms and confessions. But he had no paper, so he used the invert size of a teacup to every day sort of take notes about his ideas about how to imagine the relationship of Chinese characters and Western technology. And he would secretly sort of take notes on the bottom of his teacup and then wipe it off and save it again. And he was in there for years. And when he comes out, he will go on to invent one of the first really important shurufa, input method editors for Chinese around. He ends up having a relationship with the Graphic Arts Research Foundation, with a German precision engineering firm. So that's one character that I really learned a lot about. And the other, who I start the book out, is an incredible woman born in China, Lois Liu, who lives a really dramatic life. A war-torn family, flees to the United States following the Second World War. And she is on her own in the United States. She probably is maybe middle high school educated. She's living with a husband she was betrothed to, sight unseen, by her family, living in a back room in a laundromat, the husband's laundromat. Eventually gets a job as a kind of a factory worker at IBM, but will go on to become the person who masters the IBM electric typewriter and demonstrates it to journalists and entrepreneurs and diplomats all over the United States, all over China. And I had a chance to speak with her. She passed away recently, but I spent about 13 years trying to find her, and eventually did. And we had this one incredible conversation about her life. I spoke to her family as well. And she's on the cover of the book. Lois Liu is.
You also mentioned this MIT professor who.
Oh yeah, Samuel Caldwell is well. He's a fascinating individual as well. He was a student of Vannevar Bush. He was the advisor to Huffman. If any computer science, Huffman in coding. He was the mentor of that person. And mid-career, following a kind of inspiring set of conversations with his overseas Chinese students at MIT, where he learned a little bit about the Chinese language, he basically had a mid-career change where he suddenly stopped working expressly on logical circuit design and instead tried to set out and succeeded in creating a computational system for Chinese. So there are maybe a dozen to 24 stories of these kinds of individuals sort of peppered throughout the book, who are their one joining feature, I guess, is they gravitated again towards this wicked hard problem of how do you computerize a writing system that, based on the way that computerization has been conceptualized in the United States, in the Anglophone world, seems impossible. There should not be able to be such a thing as a Chinese computer. And they did not accept that idea. And they failed and failed and failed and failed and failed and then succeeded.
Yeah.
And then they were forgotten.
I hope people definitely read the book when they came out in May. And I think it's fascinating is because typical people may not appreciate, like, for me, because I learned Chinese and English, and on the same computer, I can type in English, like a typical person here does. But there is one tiny button you add on in Chinese and some other language that's similar to Chinese, which doesn't have an alphabet. And then you can use an input system to use the same computer and then work in Chinese. It looks incredibly easy now, but incredibly impossible when computer was first invented under the alphabet English system. This is really fascinating, and I hope people read even if the book is not yet out, your previous books are also great, helpful, with lots of wonderful personal stories. Aside from reading the books, where can people find out more of your research and your, engagements, insights?
Yeah, I appreciate that. No, I really do enjoy kind of scholarship beyond just the classroom. So, long story short, I have a YouTube channel, a TikTok channel, I'm on LinkedIn and X. I sometimes curate museum exhibitions. And then more and more I've been working on mentoring others through various. To me, research is one of the greatest joys of life, and I think of research as a way of life. And so it is. You often find me now in workshops in private sector, but also in across the academy, high schools, all the way up to full professor. But no, I would love if anyone wants to reach out, find me on LinkedIn, and then maybe we could pick up the conversation there and see where it takes us. But thanks so much.
Thank you so much. And I know that you guys run career, mentorship programs, and I think, if scientific discovery is probably the place where mentorship matters. And I myself have, helped by others in so many different ways, and I may not be able to repay back myself indirectly, but I try to, mentor others, if they, if they're open to it, just share my experiences. But this is great. Again, Professor Mullaney, who has a book coming, Chinese Computers, his previous books, like Chinese typewriters, and several of other related books, all fascinating read. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me.